In this episode of my book podcast, I'm recommending four different books I've read about Roald Dahl. I like each one of them, especially the ones he wrote, and we'll jump right into those. The first autobiography of Roald Dahl, and I assume you know who Roald Dahl is. He's the author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, many other beloved children's books, The Fantastic Mr. Fox, James and the Giant Peach, and so forth. He also wrote books for adults and many short stories. There are, I believe, three Twilight Zone episodes based on his short stories, and he had a TV series of his own at one point. It was very much like the Twilight Zone. All right, so his first autobiography is called Boy: Tales of Childhood, and he talks about some pretty stark aspects of growing up, but he does it in his usual kind of humorous way, and it's actually a pretty fun read. I've read it multiple times. Some things he talks about are personal tragedies. He lost his father and his older sister when he was very young. He also talks about his Norwegian roots. If you've read the book The Witches, you'll remember, I believe, the grandmother in that book is Norwegian, and so he's obviously drawing on family history. When you read these biographies of Roald Dahl, you catch little pieces of information there that do show up in his stories, including his famous books. But he had kind of a little bit of a tragic family life. He also went to boarding school, and this part comes across as very stark. It's abusive by today's standards. He was beaten and got in trouble and all these things, but he focuses, of course, on kind of the fun parts of it. He has a chapter called, I believe, The Great Mouse Plot, and it's about a time when he and his friends were upset with the owner. I think her name was Mrs. Pratchett of the local candy store. They used to go there to buy their candies, and so they managed to put a dead mouse in one of her jars with predictably hilarious results, followed by a caning by the headmaster at the school. So that story should come as no surprise to you. It seems like classic Roald Dahl. It's exactly how you'd expect him to be as a child. He also wrote letters home, and there is, I believe, a book of his letters home. I forget the title of it, and I've only kind of perused it. It would be hard to sit down and read straight through that one. But Boy is an excellent book that I recommend. The second autobiography by Roald Dahl is called Going Solo, and this is pretty interesting, although it's completely different from the prior one. This is based on his work in World War II as a pilot. He talks a lot about East Africa where he was stationed. There's a great chapter about a black mamba snake and capturing that. He talks about crashing in his plane. I believe his first published article, which is in there, is about a plane crash that he was in. He was part of obviously the Royal Air Force for the UK and actually got injured in Libya when his plane crashed. He was apparently quite a good pilot and has some really interesting stories and insights there. And he just kind of slightly deals in this book with his transition from being a pilot to other government work. He was transferred to the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., and there he met famous people, including President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. And he just barely touches on that in the book. Again, Going Solo is an excellent read. I've read it multiple times. But the next book kind of takes off where Going Solo leaves us. This book came out, I would have to guess, like 10 or 15 years ago, and it's called The Irregulars, Roald Dahl and the British Spy Ring in Wartime Washington. And this really gets into his work in Washington. It might seem contrary to character if you only know him from his children's books, but Roald Dahl was a British spy working in the United States. And the goal of British intelligence at that time was to get the United States to enter World War II, obviously on the side of the Allies fighting Nazi Germany. It was the UK found itself in desperate circumstances, and it was obviously believed that America could turn the tide of the war and keep Britain free. So you can understand why he was willing to come to the United States and use whatever political maneuvering and other tactics were necessary to get the U.S. into the war. He also knew other spies, including Ian Fleming, who would go on to write the James Bond books, which were made into how many movies now. That's kind of interesting when you think about it. So obviously Ian Fleming used his experience in the Secret Service to inform his books. He ended up writing books that were kind of a glamorized, fanciful version of what he had actually done. Roald Dahl did that much less. If you look carefully at his books, you'll see in, again, the Fantastic Mr. Fox, but especially in his short stories, you'll see people doing covert spy-like maneuvers, but none of his books are actual spy books. So it's interesting that he chose to avoid that topic. As far as I know, there could be a short story somewhere that I've missed that is actually about spies, but I don't think so. Anyway, the book is interesting. It talks about him engaging in social relationships and romances as well to try to influence policy. He specifically talks about Claire Booth Luce, who was a congresswoman and was famous in her own right as a playwright at the time. So if you want to see a unique and new side of Roald Dahl, that will be an eye-opening book. Then the fourth one is kind of what you would think of as a biography, a comprehensive biography. It's called Storyteller, the authorized biography of Roald Dahl. So, of course, Roald Dahl and his estate cooperated with the author, or appears to have cooperated. And this provides an overview of his life, but focuses far more on his writing than the other biographies. In fact, the other biographies hardly talk about writing at all. I mean, Going Solo makes it clear that he started writing as a pilot, but this is the one that really covers his writing process. So he had a garden shed in his backyard. It talks about him sitting in there doing his writing. He used yellow legal pads, talks about all the habits that he followed as part of his writing. So if you're a writer yourself, it could be especially interesting. It also talks, though, about personal challenges he faced, including health issues, problems with family members, and it also kind of looks at where his dark humor comes from and maybe more controversial aspects of his personality. He was he often comes across in interviews as being gruff, and some people felt like he had a difficult personality. I Every interview I've seen him in, I thought was great. And I think there was a BBC documentary you can probably find, hopefully available online, that included some interviews. I think on YouTube you could pretty freely find some good Roald Dahl interviews. I think he's funny and interesting. The there When he had that TV series, and I'm forgetting the name just now, some people accused him of being egotistical, and again, like I say, some people accused him as being difficult. The Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory movie that came out in the 70s, I think, is one of the best children's movies ever made. Apparently, he didn't like it, but as the author, you kind of have the right to not like a book made on your work, I suppose. At any rate, if you like Roald Dahl like I do, when I look back at books I've read and what I've really enjoyed, I think he's one of my favorite writers. I think he's clever and funny and subversive in a wholesome way for the most part. You can't do much better than Roald Dahl, so do check out these four biographies. Each one of them is fun, and they're completely different from each other.